May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
I heard Mark's gospel compared to a symphony this morning, and the point that was made was that when we first read Mark's gospel, it seems so simple. Immediately they told Jesus about Simon's mother-in-law. Each thing happens one after another. And then as we look more closely at Mark's gospel, new layers of meaning come out, and it goes from being a simple melody to having multiple voices speaking one with another, until the layers of meaning and beauty that emerge are like the difference between a simple sung melody and the sound of a symphony filling a hall. There's a whole lot of story going on in Mark's gospel, even in the little snippet that we heard this morning. They leave the synagogue where Jesus has just healed a man of an unclean spirit, and they go to Simon and Andrew's house. And there Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, and then at the end of that day, when the sun has set and the Sabbath is over, they bring all the people in the town who need healing to Jesus there at the door of Simon's home. And after a long night of teaching and healing, Jesus goes off early in the morning while it is still dark to find a deserted place and pray. And the other disciples go looking for him, searching for him, hunting for him until they find him. And he says, "Let's go. We must go to the surrounding towns and villages of Galilee and spread the good news." All of that happens in those short verses that Deacon Allen just read for us today. And in order to find that beautiful symphony in something as spare as Mark's gospel, we have to pay attention to the details, individual words, and the connection between one idea and the next, how they relate to each other. It begins by saying that they left the synagogue, and in the evening at sunset, it says, they brought all the people to Jesus to be healed who needed healing. And why would they say that, in the evening at sunset? Doesn't that seem redundant? I mean, they could have just said at sunset. The point here is that these people were obeying the Sabbath law. So there's a detail. The Sabbath is going to become so important in later healing stories, right? So there's an important detail there. And then they left the synagogue and went to Simon and Andrew's house, and immediately they told Jesus that Simon's mother-in-law, Simon Peter, his mother-in-law, was sick with a fever in bed. Did you know Peter was married? Peter was married. Such an important detail that brings so much more life and interest to these disciples that traveled with Jesus. He was married and he had a mother-in-law, and she lived in the house with them there. And then this detail. Jesus took her by the hand and lifted her up. The Greek word that gets translated here as lifted her up is exactly the same word that is used all the way in the 16th chapter, in the 5th verse, I believe it is, when the angel says to the women who came to find Jesus at the tomb, to prepare his body at the tomb, the angel says, "He is not here. He has been lifted up. Tell the other disciples that he has gone ahead of them to Galilee." He has been lifted up. The word we translated as resurrected is lifted up. And it's the same word that is used to describe what Jesus did here when he took Simon's mother-in-law by the hand. He took her by the hand and he lifted her up. This is a story of resurrection. This is one of those times when what happens at the beginning of the gospel is connected with what happens at the end of the gospel. It's not a coincidence. And it tells us that everything that happens in between is a story of resurrection and how resurrection came into the world through Jesus. Resurrection happens. It's a real thing. It happens in the world around us. I heard a story several years ago about a friend of ours, someone that you know. This is a story that Joseph told me. I think he was like 19 years old when this story happened. He might have even been only 17, and he was living on his own. And he had started working as a cook. He was working in a kitchen of a restaurant, and he bought himself a motorcycle to get around on, Joseph and his motorcycles. Unfortunately, he broke his arm, and he was unable to work. And he didn't have enough money to both pay his rent and buy himself food. And so he paid his rent so that he would have a room to sleep in. And he was hungry. And it had been about 2 days since he had had any food to eat, and he couldn't work because of his broken arm, so he couldn't go to the restaurant to work, and he didn't know what to do. He was hungry. And so Joseph had the thought, I will go to a church and ask if they will feed me. And so he went to a church, I don't know which one, but it was here in Seattle. He went to a church and he knocked at the door, and a minister came to the door and what can I do for you? And Joseph said, I'm hungry. I haven't had anything to eat for 2 days, and I can't afford to buy any food. Do you have any food? And the guy looked a little bit like, I don't know. I mean, I'll check. And so he went back into the church, and he came back with a can of green beans, a single can of green beans. He said, this is all I could find that you could eat in our kitchen. And he gave it to Joseph. And Joseph took that can of green beans back to the room that he was renting, and he ate it. Now, I don't think he enjoyed it. He didn't even heat it up. But he remembered that. He remembered that moment of kindness. And today he has created our feeding ministries here at St. Dunstan's Church. I have another story, a wonderful story of resurrection. I served as a chaplain in a hospital, and one day I walked into a room to meet one of the new patients that had come into the hospital that day, and there was an older gentleman lying in the bed, and his arm was up on cushions, and his arm was grotesquely swollen. I mean, it was just horrible. And what had happened was that the arteries in his arm were failing. And the reason the arteries were failing was because they had been badly repaired decades earlier in a MASH unit in the Korean War. See, this man had been a part of an attack on a hill. They had to take this hill, and they were told to storm this hill, and he ran up the hill with the rest of the soldiers, and an explosion happened, destroying his arm. And he told me this wonderful, amazing story of how he survived that explosion. A story of being carried back from the front, being carried over the shoulder of a medic or some soldier that carried him from where he had been hit. And then he was placed on a stretcher, and they carried him with the battle going on around him on a stretcher. And then they put the stretcher over the back of a Jeep, and they drove the Jeep. And then they put him on one of those crazy helicopters with the bubble on it that, if you've seen the old show MASH, that's what he's talking about. One of those stretchers on the side of one of those little helicopters, and they flew him further away. And that's how they got him to the MASH unit where they repaired his arm. And then the next thing he knew, he woke up and he was in the back of a large truck that was an ambulance with pallets of soldiers in it. And when he woke up, there was a chaplain leaning over him, holding a cross and saying prayers. And in that moment, this soldier, this man, was terrified that the chaplain saying prayers over him was saying last rites. And he cursed him. He said, "Get the H away from me." He used foul language and cursed him and told him to go away and leave him alone because he was not going to die. And here we were all these years later, and the man told me this story with tears in his eyes. I had wondered, why was he so nervous about talking to me when I first entered the room? He wasn't eager to see me. And that's not unusual when a chaplain goes into a room, but this guy seemed really reluctant. And something told me that I should stay and visit with this guy. Something told me that there was more going on here than just being uncomfortable with the visit from a chaplain before his surgery. We had been taught by the head of this chaplaincy program that I was participating in about something called the ministry of presence. Now, if you've spent any time with contemplative prayer or with centering prayer, the classes that I've taught on centering prayer, we talk about the presence and action of God within. The presence and action of God within and among us. We trust that God is present in us and among us. And in chaplaincy, we trust that God is present in us and among us. And when we enter into the room of a patient to visit with them and pray with them, that presence is there. And so it's important to show up for people with the ministry of presence. So he told me this story, and when he got to the part about cursing the chaplain that was praying over him, and he didn't know what he was praying, he broke into tears and he said, "I have felt guilt about that moment for 30 years. I have felt the guilt of that moment ever since then. I feel terrible about what I have said, and so I don't know that I can pray with you today." And I looked at him with those tears in his eyes, and I took his hand, the uninjured one, and I said to him, "I am your chaplain, and I forgive you." The story of Joseph receiving a simple can of beans, and the story of a moment of forgiveness for an old soldier. These are stories of resurrection. Think of all the ways that we die inside. Think of all the ways that we suffer and grieve. Think of the feeling of shame that closes us down. Think of all the ways that we hunger and thirst for life. We need resurrection. We need that new life that Jesus received in the tomb. But so often we think of resurrection as something that only happened to Jesus on the third day, lying there in that tomb, and is only something that is only done or given by God. We think of it as this one-time event of divine intervention. But what if instead resurrection is as simple as giving life to someone who needs it? What if resurrection is as simple as giving hope to someone who despairs? or giving company to someone who is lonely. A loving touch to someone who has lost heart, or giving a coat to someone who is cold, or a meal or a can of beans to someone who is hungry. The giving of love that recognizes the Christ in someone else, that is an act of giving life. And that is an act of resurrection. The giving of yourself, it is that ministry of presence. That trusting that God is present within us and among us and through us for each other and for others. Trust that God is present in you. See the Christ in the other, and then be there. Show up. Joseph's story and that Korean vet's story and your story, when you have been there for a friend in a time of need, these are stories of resurrection. Think of all the ways that we die and all the ways that we suffer and grieve. Think of all the ways that we hunger and thirst for life. Jesus took all of that on. He bore our burdens, our loss, and our suffering, and he took them to the cross to die. And in the tomb on the third day, he was lifted up, resurrected. Resurrection life is available to all of us now. Resurrection happens for each of us. For each of the ways that we die, there is a path to new life through the giving and receiving of God's love. For each of the ways that we suffer and grieve, we can be lifted up and find new life through the kindness of a hand offering, reaching out and lifting someone else up. For each of the ways we hunger and thirst, we can be fed, even as we offer food and drink to those who hunger and thirst. Resurrection happens when we show up. When we show up confident that God is present, acting in us, among us, and through us. When we see the Christ in the other, be there. Show up. Give the gift of life. Participate in resurrection life together.